Okay, so this video is going to help give you some pointers about the physical geography question on your CAT for this week. If we have a look at the question, remember it's a 20-mark question. Assess the relative importance of weathering and erosion in the development of coastal landscapes. Now, it's a good idea to unpick the question a little bit, just get to grips with some of the key terminology in there. If we think about the command word in this question, to assess, what we need to make sure that we are doing is weighing things up, coming to a judgment, making a decision, presenting a viewpoint about something. In this case, the relative importance of weathering and erosion. Now, that phrase relative importance is actually critical here. We're not thinking about weathering and erosion in relation to other things. We are thinking about their importance relative to each other. So thinking about the role of weathering and the role of erosion and which one actually has the greater importance in helping to shape coastal landscapes. The final bit is really important as well. So the idea of a landscape. We want to move away from thinking about just individual landforms and actually how important are these processes in helping to create landscapes, which remember are an assembly of landforms. Within the question there are two things that you're being marked on. One of those is what we call AO1, or your knowledge and understanding of the processes. So you need to make sure you've got very good descriptions and explanations of processes of weathering and erosion. You're using the right kind of terminology. You're making accurate and specific reference to places or events. The second thing though is you're being marked on your application of that knowledge and understanding. So we don't just want to be giving lengthy explanations and definitions of these processes. That would only score us half marks because we'd only be hitting that first band. The second strand on this application of knowledge, this is where we are putting forward a viewpoint and we're presenting an argument and we're trying to come to a conclusion at the end. Now, there are a number of ways in which you could structure this answer. This was actually a question on one of the A-level exams a few years ago, and I read lots and lots of responses when I was marking that paper. By far the most common approach, and actually a really good one, was to separate the answer into weathering and erosion processes, and then maybe to think about the balance between the two of them. If we think about weathering processes, we can't really ignore mass movement that goes along with that. Remember, weathering processes ultimately create and lead to mass movement processes. So we want to be thinking about the role that weathering plays in creating those kind of things like landslides and rockfalls, and how important those processes are at shaping the landscape. Remember, the geology is going to be really important in terms of determining which type of mass movement we're going to get, whether it's going to be a rockfall or a landslide or a slump. That's going to come down to the rock type and the way that that rock is structured. You also want to be making some reference to examples of landscapes. So don't get caught up too much in the processes themselves. You want to try and illustrate where those processes are having an influence. So locally, we can think about the case study that we've used of Dorset. We can think about somewhere like Lyme Regis as having a landscape that is very significantly influenced by the presence of weathering and mass movement, much more so than other parts of the coastline in Dorset. Moving on to erosional processes, again we might want to think about how those erosional processes create specific landforms, but we don't just want to resort in this answer to just explaining the formation of a stack or explaining the formation of a wave cut platform. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to think more broadly than that. How important generally are erosional processes in shaping landscapes? Now, in many ways, that's going to come down to, again, the geology is going to be important, whether it's a high or low energy coastline, whether it's a concordant or discordant coastline. Those things might help to influence the rate of those erosional processes, and how distinctive the landscape becomes as a result. Again, we want to be making reference to some landscapes that are going to be useful at supporting some of our points here. So places like the area around Durdle Door and Lulworth Cove, somewhere that's very influenced by erosion, maybe Swanage and the headland and bay system we've got around there. They're good examples of particular landscapes to use. Above all, within this answer, what you really want to be doing is considering the balance between the two things. You want to be thinking about how much of an influence does weathering have, how much of an influence does erosion have, how much do the two of them have combined, and trying to present that viewpoint in your answer. You may not have instantly a definitive idea about that in your head, so maybe as part of the planning stage you do need to sit there and think about, well, what do I think about this? What's my opinion of how important weathering or erosion processes are? Are they quite important? Are they very important? Are they not that important? How much more important is one in relation to the other? There is an opportunity, perhaps within the conclusion, to think about other significant factors like deposition, like maybe human intervention. You can think about the roles that they play in shaping the landscape. However, I would really just leave that to the conclusion, because the bulk of your answer does need to be focusing on weathering and erosion processes. As I've said before, you want to avoid lengthy descriptions of those processes. Don't get bogged down in focusing on the definitions of processes. You want to spend your time explaining about how much influence those processes have on certain landscapes. Remember, as always, within a 20-mark question, we want to be thinking about different scales. So there's an opportunity to think about different places within your landscape examples that you might mention. You might also consider different time scales. So in the short term versus the long term, does that change your opinion of how important relatively weathering and erosion processes are? And as I've said before, make sure you're not just making reference to individual landforms. You want to think about landforms assembling together as being what we mean by a landscape. Very important that you come to a conclusion at the end, so you want to make sure that you are explaining your ideas as you go along, building towards that conclusion, but really importantly at the end, making it very, very clear how important you think those processes are in relation to one another. And as I've said already, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer to that. You could argue it either way, depending on how you want to illustrate your point with different processes and different examples. So don't get too hung up on worrying about whether you've presented the right viewpoint. If you haven't presented a viewpoint, that is a bigger problem than maybe arguing it in a slightly different way. So hopefully that's useful to you. Remember to go back and have a look at your notes on those processes and the stuff that we did about the Dorset case study. There's lots of good opportunities there to use some examples from that case study.